endogenous retroviruses. So we've provided more content on ERVs than I think anybody. So we're just going to kind of give our thought. It's almost like we're having a discussion with Viced Rhino, and we're not necessarily going to go through all our slides and do what we typically do with visuals, because we've already done that. And somebody like Viced Rhino, he's not really capable anyways. He's not equipped with countering the points we would make. So we're just going to have some fun with this, right, Matt? We're going to have some fun responding to Viced Rhino. The reason why is, you'll notice in the very beginning, he says that this topic, watch, Matt, you'll see. This topic is the best, he says, the best evidence for evolution. All right. If it's the best and it's debunked, what does that mean, Matt?
It means their best is still worthless.
Exactly. Their best is still worthless. I love it. Hey, that could be a good shirt there, right? Because we keep putting out new shirts at the ministry, Creationist Clothing. The evolutionist best is still worthless. Hashtag ERVs. Okay, I'm going to go mute from the mic. So this is going to be our test run. Make sure there's no echo. Everything's good. Okay, brother?
Sounds
Here we
good.
go.
Today I'm giving you the 11th installment of my Evidence for Evolution series, and while this series does not have to be watched in order, this episode will be building on some things that we learned in the sequence homology episode, so if you're new to the series, or if it's been a while since you watched the sequence homology one, consider watching that one first. It's not critical, but some of the stuff here will make a bit more sense if you have seen it first. This episode is going to be all about endogenous retroviruses, or ERVs.
Everything's coming in good, Matt?
Yep, sounds great.
So what he just said there about his series, homology, vestigial structure, so on and so forth, we've countered a lot of that. We did a series with Kent listing off what Viced Rhino thinks is good evidence for evolution. We've had Dr. Grady McMurtry respond to a little bit as well. Going back years ago now, I think maybe 3 years ago, time flies by when you're having fun refuting evolutionists, right? We did a 3-4 hour response to Viced Rhino. I think it was on molecular clocks or Adam and Eve, something like that. And we were comprehensive, and this is 3 years ago, and he never responded. So, 3 years should be enough for him to come up with a decent rebuttal. Clearly he doesn't have one. I think that's why he doesn't debate or go in open mics or actually put himself in the hot seat where he has to engage and spar with an informed creationist. These guys, these popular evolutionists like Pelagia, Viced Rhino, Professor Stick, they hide behind their script. They hide behind their video script that they take a couple months to work on. They read through it. They edit it. The editing's great. Sure. Great video. But I want to see you defend these arguments, because anybody can put together a script, read it off, make a video. I want to see them defend. I want them to enter the debate dojo, and I want to see Viced Rhino defend his arguments in a live exchange. Right, Matt?
Yeah, he hides behind a cartoon character, so it makes you think he won't hide behind his channel never going live. There's a reason why they don't, They know they don't know the topic. They know they don't even know our position on the topic. So if they don't even know our position, how can they even debate us?
Right.
Half the time they get it wrong anyway. Even after they watch our content for hours, they still get it wrong.
Especially something as technical as ERVs. Now, to his credit, I think Viced Rhino, I don't follow him all that frequently, but I think he does do possibly live Q&A. I've seen his face. I've seen him do that. I'm not sure if he does like open mics or anything like that, but we do. So he's always welcome to join those. Okay, let's continue, brother.
For short. This is, in my opinion, probably the strongest line of evidence for evolution that exists. So let's take a look. Let's start with an explanation of what exactly an ERV even is. A virus, as you probably already know, is a type of not quite alive organism that is incapable of reproducing by itself. It must use another organism's cells as its machinery for producing more of itself. It will insert its DNA into the host cell, and the normal transcription process of the cell will then work on the viral DNA to produce more copies of the virus. A retrovirus, on the other hand, uses RNA as its genetic material. A DNA virus just has to plunk its DNA down into the cell, and the normal chemistry of the cell will go ahead and transcribe that DNA. But a retrovirus can't do that. Because it uses RNA as its genetic material rather than DNA, it must first find a way to turn that RNA into DNA.
So here's the first question for Viced Rhino and any other evolutionists out there. You ready for it, Matt?
Mm-hmm.
In light of what we know about these retroviruses, RNA viruses, they require a host to replicate. So what came first, according to the evolutionist and according to the evolutionary fairy tale? The host or the retrovirus? It can't be the retrovirus, because the retrovirus needs a host to what? To replicate.
To live.
Go ahead. What are you going to say?
Yeah, it just needs one to survive. It needs one to live, and we need them just as much. It's a perfect symbiotic relationship. So what did come first? We need them to have children.
And that's why the creationists, the biblical creationists, we have the best model that has the strongest explanatory power when it comes to the origin of harmful retroviruses. We've discussed it many times. I just put a short recently, and I discussed it in my book, and it hasn't been refuted. And even the conventional literature is now arguing for a variation of the biblical creation escapee hypothesis. If the retrovirus, and it does, it requires a host to replicate. Okay, we have hosts with cells. Okay, trillions and trillions of cells. And you have God that created the original created kinds, including humans, and he front loaded them with genetic diversity, but all types of functional DNA units like ERVs, all kinds of classes of retrotransposons. We know they're functional in a number of ways, which we'll get into a little bit later. So, but from there, after the fall, due to errors in the packaging process, recombination, mutations, environment, you have escapees, where you have these rogue viruses escaping the host cell. From there, they can cross species and they can enter another species, but that's not its original host. So that creature may not be able to regulate the virus, the retrovirus. So now it burns hot and fast, and it results in disease. But originally that retrovirus came from a host, is the point. And that's the best explanation. That's the biblical creationist explanation, one of them. And the evolutionists currently lack a good theory on that. So unless you wanted to add anything, Matt, I'll keep going.
No, let's play.
So let's see if Viced Rhino ever answers that question. Okay, brother? What's the date today? We're going to mark it. We'll see how long it takes him.
June 5th.
June 5th at whatever time, depending on your time zone. So we'll see, okay? And we don't want stories. We don't want imagination, Viced Rhino. We understand that you imagine you're related to a strawberry and a banana plant, a whale, and a puppy dog. We want that which is empirical, that which can be tested, that which is observable, repeatable. Right, Matt? Evolutionary philosophy.
For the host cell to transcribe. This is why it gets the prefix retro, because it has to reverse transcribe its RNA into DNA before anything can be done with it. Retro as a prefix essentially just means backward. The method that retroviruses have developed for accomplishing this task is to use an enzyme that is aptly named reverse transcriptase to transcribe the RNA in reverse back into DNA. And then
wow. These really sound amazingly designed, don't they, Matt?
Yeah, exactly. Look at that.
And it used another aptly named enzyme called integrase to integrate its genetic material directly into the host's DNA. Unlike a DNA virus whose presence will eventually kill the cell, there's not necessarily a significant detriment for a host cell that becomes infected, and occasionally the infection can even be beneficial. Every now and then, a retrovirus will infect the gametes of an organism, and so enter the germline. This is when a normal old retrovirus becomes endogenous. Endogenous in biology refers to something that originates inside of an organism. So a retrovirus that is not passed on genetically is an exogenous retrovirus. The organism must become infected with that virus externally, while one that is passed down genetically is endogenous. The organism will be born with it,
So another way to understand it is your exogenous retroviruses like HIV, that's an exogenous retrovirus. They're transmitted or passed along horizontally. ERVs would be passed along vertically. Endogenous, they occur from within. Exogenous, they occur from outside. And so the story goes basically that ancient viral infections from exogenous retroviruses, they infiltrated and infected the cell in the right way, which would be in a germ cell line, a reproductive cell, where it can be transmitted to progeny. It can be passed on vertically to become an endogenous retrovirus. From there, every cell of that host has the viral DNA. But now, over time, mutations would essentially have to destroy or wipe away the harmful aspects or components of that endogenous retrovirus. And eventually it'll have to co-opt a novel function or evolve a novel function through beneficial mutation accumulation, something like that. Okay. So that's basically how the story goes. And we'll see that it's a lot of wishful thinking. Anything you want to add there, Matt?
No, let's see where he's going with this. He's still teaching people what it is. He's not even getting anywhere yet.
Right. Exactly. All good evidence for design.
comes from inside the organism. ERVs are easy to identify because they always have the same structure, and this structure matches modern retroviruses that still give us grief, like HIV. On either end of the retroviral DNA will be two identical sequences known as long terminal repeats, or LTRs. These sequences are essentially the first bits to infiltrate the host DNA, and their job, in an oversimplified nutshell, is to make space for the rest of the retroviral DNA in between them. In between the two LTR sequences, we find the genetic material to encode for three main proteins: group antigens, abbreviated GAG, which are the proteins that make up the core of the virus, POL, which codes for the reverse transcriptase, and ENV, or ENV. I'm not sure if I'm actually supposed to be reading these out or just saying the letters, but ENV is the envelope protein, which codes for the envelope that makes up the body of the virus. Each individual virus is different, but they all have these same structures.
Our passion for winemaking started over 30 years ago. We harvest at the peak of ripeness, crafting rich, vibrant flavors in every glass.
Commercial time. Now, I will say, after we're done with our comments and our video here and questions, if anybody in the chat wants to join after that, feel free. I see Max the Atheist say the copium is strong here. Well, that's not really a rebuttal to anything. So, Max, I challenge you, my good man, to join later on ERVs. We'll see if you can refute my points. This ain't my first rodeo on ERVs. So I actually sweat and bleed ERVs now, Matt, after studying it so much over the last few years. So, Max, stick around, my friend. Stick around. All right, here we go. Commercial time.
Jackson Triggs Cabernet Sauvignon wins on taste.
So, what do viruses hijacking our systems to reproduce have to do with evolution? Well, it's quite simple, really. ERVs are essentially inserted into the genome of the host species at random, with there being, conservatively, about 50 million potential insertion points for the average grade ape genome. With the size of the genomes and the random nature of the ERV insertion, the chance of two identical ERVs being inserted in the same location are minuscule. So by examining the various ERVs in the genomes of the different apes, we can begin to construct a phylogeny. I think an analogy would be helpful here, so I'm going to go ahead and steal one from Apologia. It's the best analogy I've heard so far, and I don't really see a need to.
Matt, I just need to mention the question, the important question here, because Viced Rhino, he's not going over any alternative hypotheses, nothing like that. He's just assuming the evolutionary model and understanding of ERVs and ERV accumulation is correct. There's a lot of presuppositions here. The big question is this: are these really the ancient remnants of past viral infections, or are they mostly created units of DNA function? Asking that question and then exploring it is a counter or exposes his analogy here. That, well, there's only so many positions that a retrovirus can infect and infiltrate, and it would be too big of a chance for us to inherit thousands of these ERVs in the exact same spot as a chimpanzee and other primates. Okay. Because it's a statistical argument, and the chance is just, it's a very low chance. But again, that assumes that every single unit, right, Matt, is the result of an infection.
Exactly. It comes down to being designed. If you were going to design a car, where are you going to put an alarm? Well, depends on the vehicle, doesn't it? So if certain vehicles are more similar to one another, they're going to have the alarm in the same place. And therefore, other alarms are going to be in different places, beginning as a truck or a van or a car. So again, when you ask the question, you come down to answering it for yourself. And I think it's funny because ERVs have beneficial differences within different animal kinds. Why would they have them at all? Remember, junk DNA was predicted long before they discovered the ERVs. And when they discovered ERVs, they said that they also were part of the junk DNA and they would not have any beneficial function. So when they discovered it, it became another retrodiction that they now use as evidence for evolution, when it was just another falsification of it yet again. Never forget that.
Very good, brother. Never forget, they did not predict the types of functions that we see. As we're going to see, ERVs and ERV-like sequences function in embryological development. They help determine cell types, help in gene regulation, viral mimicry, cell stress responses, the immune system. Need I go on? A lot of amazing functions. And watch as he just glosses over the functions too. And sometimes they even evolve a beneficial function. Anyways, moving on. Nothing more to see here, folks, right? Just stating it like it's fact. And sometimes they even co-opt a function that makes them essential to life. You know, they just throw that in there because they know that they're largely evolutionist audience aren't going to question it. So let's continue.
To reinvent the wheel here. So here we go. So let's say you have a hypothetical collection of 10 books that are all different from each other but have differing degrees of similarity. In looking at the books, you can see that page 20 is identical across all 10 books. But on that page, 7 of the 10 books have a stain of pasta sauce that is identical in shape and location. While there is an incredibly minuscule chance that 7 individual pasta sauce splattering events created an identical splattering pattern on the page, it is far more likely that there was a splatter on the original and then the other copies were photocopied from that. So the 3 unsplattered copies were made, then the splatter happened, then the
Viced Rhino assumes that every ERV or ERV sequence is akin to this splatter or some kind of mistake or ink spill. That's the assumption. And taking away that assumption ruins the analogy. It ruins the illustration. And I think he said he got it from Conspiracy Cats, who I respect. Conspiracy Cats and I, Al, we get along well. He's been here many times, well, a couple times at least. And I've debated him on ERVs going back a few years ago. And he's a professional interlocutor. He's very smart. And so we've engaged this in our debates. And so I haven't seen Viced Rhino counter how somebody like myself or you would counter his illustration and analogy here. That's the thing, is his video that supposedly says, hey, this is the best evidence in the world for evolution. You're related to banana plants because ERVs. But he's not actually countering anything. He's not saying, hey, a possible explanation for this is this, and here's how you refute it. That would be a diligent approach, in my opinion. Anyways, let's continue.
The 7 splattered copies were made. So we can see that all 10 books shared a common book ancestor, but the 7 splattered books are more closely related to each other than to the unsplattered books. So then we notice that in the splattered books, page 24 is also identical, but in 4 of the books, there is an identical scribbling in the corner on page 24. Again, the most parsimonious explanation is that while these pages were being photocopied, 3
Again, are ERVs akin? Are they analogous to random scribblings? That's the question. Are they really the ancient remnants of past viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function?
of the copies were made before the scribbling, and 4 were made after. And we can also determine that the scribbling happened after the pasta sauce splatter. But in the books that lack the scribble, page 17 is also identical, and 2 pages of page 17 have an identical ink stain on them. So using this information, we can arrange the books in a nested hierarchy, and we can determine the relationship each book has to the other books, and we can also construct a timeline of when these page-altering events would have happened, roughly. In this analogy, the text of the book represents the genome of the organism, and the external modifications to the book, the stains and scribbles and whatnot, are the viruses. Now, of course, this analogy...
So you notice the stains, the scribbles are the endogenous retroviruses, assuming that they are the result of ancient viral infections and not even asking the important question, are they created units of DNA function? And not even attempting to answer the question, what came first, the retrovirus or the host? Because retroviruses require a host to replicate.
Is imperfect because books don't reproduce sexually last time I checked, so they're not actually reproductively related to each other, but it does kind of help get the idea across. With each...
Imagine if
so now he's allowed to use an analogy and illustration because it helps to get the idea across. But the second we start using analogies from books and vehicles or modes of transportation, suddenly we're not allowed because cars don't reproduce.
Right. Love the double
What do you think of that?
Just a typical double standard. There's no surprise there. None.
Hypocrite,
That's
right?
what they do.
Hypocrite. Just like this nested hierarchy talks about. Who cares? That's why, again, it comes down to the important question. I'm not going to repeat it for sake of time and lack of energy. Okay. If most ERVs are design units of DNA, which the evidence suggests, without them, we could not survive. They're important in the embryo. They're important in the placenta, which connects to the baby, supplies nutrients, oxygen. It's necessary for life. There's ERV sequences that during embryological development, they help safeguard the baby, the growing baby, from incoming viruses and harmful effects from external agents. They require those ERVs. And so a lot of these ERVs are only functional during certain developmental windows, like these early stages. And so these aren't the kinds of functions that can evolve. And if they can, show us how. And so in the same way that you have engines in all modes of transportation and generally located in the same place and they're essential, you remove the engine, Matt, is that vehicle going to get very far?
Not unless it's rolling downhill.
Right. Now, if I were to remove one of the internal seats or a windshield wiper or a side mirror or many of the other 100 components, can the car still run?
Yeah.
Right. Because there's components that are essential and elements that are non-essential. Well, many ERVs are essential, like the ones for embryological development, like the ones that safeguard the growing baby in the womb. And so if we share those with the chimpanzee, it's for the same reason that Chevy SUVs and Chevy sedans have engines in common. It's good design. It's common design. And if humans share more of these elements, these functional elements with a chimpanzee than they do with an orangutan or a dog or a whale, well, that's expected. We look more similar to a chimpanzee anyways. We share more in terms of anatomy, morphology, and physiology with a chimpanzee than we do with a dog. So that natural nested hierarchy is expected. And so demonstrating that these are created units of DNA function answers the nested hierarchy question, because you know what? A sedan is going to have a lot more in common with a hatchback than it will with a van or an airplane or a skateboard. So there's a natural nested hierarchy in man-made things as well. Okay, so let's continue here.
ERV, there are 3 individual data points that can be used to construct an independent phylogeny. First, there is just the general distribution of ERVs as a whole among the different taxa, which provides the overall timeline. Second, using the methods that I described in the sequence homology video, we are able to construct phylogenies based on the differences between the same ERV in the same locations on the genomes in 2 different species. If you'll recall, after 2 populations are isolated from each other, their genetic material will accumulate different mutations. These differences can be statistically mapped out in the creation of...
Matt, did you want to talk about the 2 major assumptions with the models? The evolutionary model assumes all DNA differences and so-called mutations in these units, like an ERV, are the result of mutations. What do creationists assume?
That they were designed this way, and that we would be able to predict that if you were going to use phylogeny, that it would not work because life isn't designed in this nested hierarchical pattern going back to a single common ancestor. That's why evolution did not predict that. Evolution back in the 60s by Ernest Mayr stated that there would be no genetic similarity between distantly related species because over time things mutate, and you can't mutate and not scramble something to the point of oblivion where there would be no genetic similarity. It was the creationists in the 1970s that predicted, Henry Morse of creation research, I think, that actually predicted that we would have genetic similarity. All life would share it. So it was a younger creationist prediction. So when they started building these nested hierarchical trees, they had to cherry pick which ones that they want to show the public. And all of them break down. Every single one of them, cytochrome C, which is their favorite, that breaks down in the human line after just 3 steps. And then you get the cytochrome B and compare it to C, that breaks that, they don't compare it either. So when you add endogenous retrovirus, that doesn't create the same tree either. So which one are they going to show you? They're only going to show you one at a time. And they're going to hide anything that's contrary and say, oh, well, maybe that happened because of this made up reason. Because they always fail. That's why college textbooks like Evolution 101, it doesn't show you any common ancestor to any other trees of life. Why? Because they can't definitively say that any of them are true. So they're assumption based. So they just throw it out there like, look at the tree of life that forms. And they look spectacular, right? Kent says, look at all those lines on paper. Ooh, wow, that's great. Okay, how were they made? What do they form trees? Are everything connected like they should be? Not even close. They never are.
Right, you nailed it. Why is there any similarity at all if evolution is true? If we've been evolving for millions of years and accumulating mutations, which are alterations in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. So we have all these alterations taking place in the genomes of living organisms every generation. And this is happening for millions of years. And the evolutionists assume that most of it is just neutral genetic baggage that accumulates over time and can be called upon for evolutionary change. Well, this accumulation of mutations and change and alterations in the genome over time, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, should remove any kind of homologous and nested hierarchical signature. Over time, this neutral junk should alter the sequences to the point where there's no real homologous signal, which is why, as far as I understand, they did not predict homology.
That's right. And think about what endogenous retroviruses are. They're a type of a virus looking thing, right? So what do? They mutate even faster than anything else. They mutate extremely fast. Their genomes are round, and these mutations are taking place much faster than any other region of the mitochondria, which also ticks rapidly. So this is why endogenous retroviruses sometimes cause a cancer. It's not even from the virus aspect of itself. It's from the mutations taking place in the endogenous retrovirus. So that adds a whole new complexity to things. How is there any nested hierarchical pattern when you have genomes that are constantly mutating at rapid speeds? Well, we can only do that in a young Earth creation timeline. So that's what predictions are all about. And that's what we've done. We've done multiple predictions based on mitochondria and genetic similarities, and how few mutations have accumulated total in the mitochondria based on deep time versus short amount of time. And we're going to, when we get into whales, I'm going to cover that just a little bit as well.
Perfect. Great points, brother. Here we go.
Of a phylogeny, and the presence of an ERV makes this relatively easy. Third, each ERV has 2 LTR sequences on either end. Because of how retroviruses work, these LTR sequences need to have been identical when the virus was inserted, or the viral insertion would simply have failed. Because we know that each LTR had to be identical, we can use both LTRs to construct 2 independent phylogenies, and any variation in the phylogeny will necessarily be the result of an event other than the accumulation of neutral mutations that these phylogenies rely on, and so provides a powerful error-correcting mechanism. So because each ERV that is present across multiple...
So many problems here. These guys like Viced Rhino, they say more things wrong in one sentence than words that are in that sentence, okay? You'll actually know, he's talking about the LTRs, which stand for long terminal repeats. So you have the ERV, which shares sequence similarity to retroviruses, exogenous retroviruses, which makes sense from the escapee hypothesis that basically retroviruses came from healthy cells in the host, or healthy created units of DNA function like ERVs. Okay. So your endogenous retrovirus has LTRs on either side, GAG, pol, ENV components or genes in the middle. Okay. And each are important because they code for reverse transcription, integration or integrase, reverse transcriptase. And so it's interesting because there's a lot of mobile elements that can use those components to move around the genome to help turn genes on and off. Mobile genetic elements, amazing functions. So the point is, over 90%, Matt, over 90% of ERV sequences don't actually comprise that sequence or those components, LTR, GAG, pol, ENV component. No, they simply represent solo LTRs. And they lack GAG, pol, ENV components. They're going to argue that they were once full ERVs, and over time they've degraded, they've been destroyed. Now they're just LTRs. There's not that many full ERVs that are shared, but they like to say there's thousands without telling you that most of them are just solo LTRs. But guess what, Matt? Those solo LTRs, those long terminal repeats, you know what they do? They actually serve as binding sites for initiating or enhancing gene expression. And so that tells us that these LTRs are there for a reason. They have functional roles. And so if we share thousands of them with chimpanzees or other primates, okay, that's good. That's good design, since they have important functional roles. And so it is an assumption to say that these solo LTRs, Matt, represent ERVs or components of ERVs that once were part of a full ERV. No, the evidence suggests that they're simply functional stretches of DNA. And these functional stretches of DNA are there to what? Regulate gene expression. Again, ERVs are ERV sequences. They can act as what, Matt? Promoters, enhancers, and transcription start sites for gene expression.
And even prevent other viruses from attaching.
That's right. That's right. That's why proteins from the ERV, they interfere with incoming viral particles. So these ERVs and the ERV-like sequences, they're like the antiviral programs in your computer. Your computer might be front-loaded with an antivirus program, right? You have a desktop. That's good design. And so if viruses come in, they can detect them, get rid of them, destroy them, however that works. And that's what happens when harmful viruses enter our system, is you have pre-existing ERV and ERV-like sequences that are there and ready to fight off those viruses. That's good design. How did all of that evolve, Viced Rhino? This, remember at the beginning of the video, he said, this is the best evidence for why you in the audience are related to walking sticks, mushrooms, strawberries, and puppy dogs. This is their best. And Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, what you said was even their best is what?
Horrible, trash,
Worthless.
worthless.
Right. And that's why they'll say, oh, but these components, Matt, these components, the ENV, right, envelope protein, your GAG, your pol genes, they share sequence similarity with retroviruses. So they must have come from retroviruses. You know, why would God make organisms with viral DNA? Again, all of these components, including the solo LTRs, have important functions. For example, the ENVs, the envelope proteins, they actually function in blocking harmful viruses from entering the system. Your GAG gene is important, your pol gene, your ENV, the envelope protein, okay, your LTRs. And what's interesting is your envelope proteins, they hinder incoming viruses from entering the system by basically binding to receptors that these infectious viruses like the exogenous retroviruses might use to basically enter the cells of the host. And so that blocks them from being able to do so because it's going to cause the genome harm.
Right.
I mean, these components are actually inactivating viruses before they infect new host cells. Does Viced Rhino talk about any of this? No, of course he doesn't. He doesn't talk about why these ERVs require the very specific makeup that they have, LTR, GAG, pol, ENV, to actually carry out their many operational roles. One of them is inactivating the ability of harmful viruses to do what they do, which is infect new cells. Any thoughts, brother?
Yeah, matter of fact, I like to tie it into scripture. God originally gave the Israelites permission to eat certain types of food that was clean and unclean. And nowadays, we're actually know about what some of these things actually do. We know what the swine flu is. That was considered food that was an abomination. So that one is very detrimental. So God was warning us, don't eat these types of animals because obviously he knew what would be good for us and what would not. And we did anyway. And now we know the repercussions of those things. Did you know in Australia, it's against the law to eat bats? The reason why is because they can get COVID from eating bats. And they sometimes, so if anyone's doing it, they'll get a fine or arrested for it. That you're not supposed to do it. So it's literally a law to not eat bats. But God knew that a long time ago. Don't eat bats. And snakes out of the order, right? So these carry viruses that are very detrimental, very strong and powerful viruses that when we consume these animals, we get really sick from them. That's why it was never designed that way from the beginning. That's why God gave us natural fruit from the trees to eat. And then later gave laws because he saw mankind was eating everything. Imagine we create artificial intelligence for robots and we tell them to drink only gas and oil. Don't consume anything else. You're not going to function good that way. So you look over and your little robots are out there eating everything. You're like, oh no. And then of course, some of them are mad at you because they're getting sick and unhealthy and breaking down. Where you're like, well, I only told you to consume 2 things.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you laws now. Okay, since I know you're going to consume everything you see, so avoid those. Those are the most detrimental. But we consume them anyway. And now look at all the viruses people get from consuming those foods. Highly detrimental.
Right. So that's why, you know, that kind of goes to the problem of evil, which we could talk about for a while, is a lot of the illness, disease, problems, death is because of man's doing, going against God's commands, suggestions, the way we should live as compared to the way we do live based on a lot of our bad choices.
Right. Exactly.
So I want to reiterate the amazing functional roles associated with every single one of these ERV-like sequences. And I say like because, again, over 90% of what they call ERVs, when they say, oh, how do you explain the fact that thousands and thousands of these ERVs, right, Matt, are shared between humans and chimps and other primates? The next question, the question you should ask is, wait a minute, thousands and thousands and thousands of full ERV sequences? If they know their stuff enough, like they should, they're going to say, well, no, most of them are just solo LTRs. But again, these solo LTRs are not the ancient remnants or the current remnants of past ERVs. They're functional stretches of DNA because they serve as binding sites for initiating or enhancing gene expression. Gene expression being, you got gene expression, gene regulation, right? So gene expression is the process basically by which a gene gets turned on in a cell to make what? RNA and proteins. DNA transcribed into RNA translated into a protein. So gene expression is important, and these solo LTRs are helping with that important process.
Right. And
okay, so sure, we might share thousands of those with other creatures, but they're important DNA elements. Okay, DNA sequences. Go ahead, Matt. What are your thoughts, brother?
No, they make it sound like it's huge. Like, oh my gosh, there's so many of these things in the body. Well, number-wise, there are quite a few of them. But did you know the average base pair size of an endogenous retrovirus is just 500 base pairs? Now think about that. How big is a protein coding gene in one of those cells? Thousands of base pairs long. So we're talking at things smaller than some orphan genes that go up into the thousands. These are smaller than even orphan genes, which also do transcription. They turn on and off. They're gene regulators. They're not perpetually on. Imagine if your computer was on and every single program was running at the same time. Right. Very detrimental. You wouldn't want it to. That would be a garbage computer. It wouldn't even last very long. It's like a race car maxing out all the time. That car doesn't last long. So you would want these things to be turned on when you need them and off when you don't. And that's exactly what the body does. And ERVs and orphan genes are these things that do just that. Very simple.
Amazing. And you mentioned orphan genes. Orphan genes lack any real consistent hierarchy. They want to talk about the hierarchy, but they don't want to talk about the inconsistency, cytochrome C versus cytochrome B, the Y chromosome dissimilarity, this preclusionary line of evidence that suggests evolution simply can't be the case. Because when you consider overall architecture, gene content, size differences, your human Y chromosome and chimpanzee Y chromosome, they're only about 35 to 40% the same. They're half the size. Ton of the gene content's just totally different. Heterochromatin's basically missing in the chimpanzee Y chromosome, if I remember correctly. And so, Viced Rhino, how do you address this? I want to see a response to this. Somebody like Viced Rhino, he would just be going to run to somebody like Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal anyways. These guys can't engage these counterpoints. They're just reading from their script. They're not actually equipped to refute the best biblical creation related models. And it's interesting because though he talks about, I think he said random earlier. Well, a lot of what happens in the genome is not random, including with mutations, with mutational hotspots, right? So he assumes that ERVs are largely non-functional. He'll admit to a couple functions here and there. He'll assume that the insertion mechanism is random and that the mutational events taking place are also random. That's why, they'll point to olfactory so-called pseudogenes or mutations in olfactory genes in humans and primates, like chimpanzees. But then they won't tell you that those olfactory genes, if I remember reading correctly, they're known for breaking down, for accumulating a lot of mutations. That doesn't mean that they inherited those mutations, that these are sections of the genome that are prone to damage and mutation accumulation. Isn't that right, Matt?
Exactly. And the mutations are fast. There's lots of places like that. And you have to remember too, that we're being bombarded by mutations based on where we live, what we eat, how we live our life. If we're a smoker and we're a drinker and we don't sleep good at night, we're going to get a lot more somatic mutations, which are rapid in the body. They do this from identical twins. So yeah, there's a lot of factors at play.
Exactly right, brother. Excellent point. And so if these long terminal repeats that Viced Rhino is talking about serve a functional role in the genome, where they act in gene regulation, initiate or enhance gene expression, then it goes back to the question earlier. Are these really the ancient remnants of past viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? Now, I think what he's doing here, Matt, this is where I want you to talk about molecular clocks soon, because you've pointed out a great point that these sequences or retroviruses in general, is this what you said? That they mutate faster anyways? That they have a high mutation rate?
Yes.
Okay. So he's saying basically and I wrote about this in my book, according to the evolutionary story, an exogenous retrovirus infects the germ cell line that's passed down vertically. At that point, the LTRs are identical because it's a new infection. It's a new integration event. So the LTRs would be identical, but over time, they're going to accumulate mutations. And so the LTRs over time are going to look different because they're going to be altered through mutations. And so from there, they can look at what they assume are mutations, right? DNA differences, and build a molecular clock and argue that, hey, this is roughly when this creature got this infection, and this is when this creature got this infection. This is how they're related, and they can build their phylogeny and all of that. Okay. So let's continue here. And then I'd like you to respond to the molecular clock argument he's using.
Multiple species can be used to construct 4 independent phylogenies, one from the general distribution of the ERV, one from studying the sequence homology of the ERV, and 2 from the LTRs. We have 4 independent phylogenies that can be used to check the work of the other 3. And on top of that, there are literally hundreds of these ERVs that have been used to construct phylogenies within the great ape families, all of which are in high agreement with each other. Now,
Matt, that advertisement was our cue to pause it there as we're almost done here. So I'm going to get you to respond first. I got some thoughts, but as you're giving those thoughts, I'm going to run to the restroom real quick. Apologetics 101, my brother Brian, doing great work. Partner of the channel. He's in the chat, says, can't wait for our interview on ERVs. I'm looking forward to that. June, I'll be with Brian. We're going to be doing some more shows together. We've done responses, in-depth responses to critics like Gutsy Gibbon on junk DNA, chromosome 2 fusion. And so Apologetics 101 is a blessing. Make sure to subscribe to his channel. Centurion says, love watching Donny and Matt putting the scientific smackdown on the atheist and evolutionist community. They make it too easy for us, don't they, Matt? Right? They really do. People like Viced Rhino. And so, I mean, there's really only a couple evolutionists that can keep up, right? The Gutsy Gibbons and Dr. Dan Stern Cardinals of the world. They're like the savior of people like Viced Rhino and Pelagia. That's who they go to. So that's why when we refute and engage the big dogs, then we obviously know people like Viced Rhino are not going to have any valid counters. So go ahead. What are your thoughts, brother? And I'll be listening, but I'll be back in a minute.
Sure. Well, as you guys can see from Viced Rhino, he just read from a script that he probably got from Wikipedia or Google. He just Googled it and said, look at this. It's great evidence, because his starting assumption is that endogenous retroviruses, one time long ago in the very past, vast distance of time, a virus infected somebody. They survived the viral infection, and they passed it on generation after generation until eventually the viral load that it carried is completely wiped out, and then it's a clean slate. The virus did nothing, and then somehow it gained a beneficial function, and then kept getting passed on through generations over eons of time until we see them today and say, oh, look, that mutation, that endogenous retrovirus must have come from that ancient viral infection that our great ancestors got. The only problem with that is you can never be able to test that theory, because anytime we would go that far back into the past, we wouldn't be able to even test for that endogenous retrovirus. That's why they love the storyline so much, because again, they just can ignore where did these come from. Was it something created? They would never, ever go for something like that. So it has to be naturalistic evolutionary mindset to even get into being taught into the public school. Endogenous retroviruses were predicted to be junk DNA. They turned out to not be junk DNA. They had multiple functions. So that was a failure for evolutionary predictions. So then they made retrodictions based on that. They never predicted what they found. So it's very easy to refute endogenous retroviruses because we have an entirely different model and they don't accept it. That's not our problem. They don't accept a lot of things. Who cares? Ours, what we want to know is what is the best explanation. And if you use evolution, you're going to assume that natural selection is going to always remove the most detrimental mutations, and to some degree it can, but it's always going to leave some. And because mutation rates are fast and not slow like evolution predicted, then we really need to know this when it comes to medicine. Because if genetic entropy is true, then we need to say, uh-oh, the genome is decaying rapidly, more rapid than we think it is. We need to spend more efforts on genetic sequencing, on looking at exactly what genes do. We need to be looking at CRISPR-Cas9, which is gene editing sequencing. So if we clip certain mutations out of the genome, are we going to mess ourselves up by doing that? Are we going to remove something extremely beneficial by doing it? Right now, we don't know enough because evolution mindset has us thinking that most of the genome is junk. We don't care what it does. We don't need to look at what it does. So that type of mindset for hundreds of years has led to things like vestigial organs. Just remove it. It has no function. Get rid of that appendix. Who cares what it does? It's better to have it removed than have it burst on you. It's like, oh, and then we find, what does it do? It produces killer B cells, which work on the inside of the cell, very similar how the thyroid produces killer T cells that work on the outside of the cell as an immune system. So it's very good to have another perspective. Unfortunately, people are emotionally upset that young Earth creation exists, so they don't even consider it because they're too emotionally involved that I hate it. It can't be true. Well, just assume that it might be, and then if you do that, now you will have two different views, not just of the past, but of the future. We'll look at medicine entirely different. How many lives have been lost because of evolutionary views in medicine and the removal of vital organs, gallbladder removal surgery, appendix removal surgery, just constantly removing things because they're useless. They don't do anything beneficial anymore. So just get rid of it. Who knows how many lives have been lost? So if we look at the genome as crumbling, then we're going to treat medicine much more different. We're going to attack it. It's going to be very beneficial for humans in 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. But if we don't look at it that way, and we just wait for natural selection will help us, it'll save us. Really, look around. Do you know anybody that in your family that doesn't have cancer, heart disease, or diabetes? No, you know tons of people in your family that have these problems. So clearly, there's problems that are arising. And natural selection is doing nothing for helping us. Animals are dying from genetic degradation and loss. So I've ranted long enough. You're back.
No, you rant as long as you want, brother. Those are excellent points. And that's why it's so important to recognize the fact that not all DNA differences or DNA variation or so-called discrepancies are the result of mutations or evolutionary processes over time. And so that is what Viced Rhino is assuming. He's assuming that every single one of these ERVs and ERV-like sequences are the ancient remnants of past viral infections. He's assuming that the mutations within the ERV sequence that form a nested hierarchy, right? He's talking about multiple phylogenies. Again, it all goes back to, are these created units of DNA function? And a lot of what they assume are mutations, Matt, can you speak to this, may actually represent functional differences between creatures like humans, chimpanzees, orangutans, dogs, right? We also believe in multifunctional genes. Okay. So building a phylogeny based on so-called mutations assumes that these are mutations that we're actually looking at in the first place, rather than functional differences. Would you agree with that, brother?
Absolutely. And that's a prediction that's been made quite a while ago. So again, that's what we're finding. And we're finding different layers stacked up in the genome. It gets more complex the more we learn. And the more we learn, the more it confirms our model. And evolution is getting horrible. Look at this list that I made. Just look at that. We've dominated every single prediction in the past, completely dominated it. And from head-to-head predictions. These aren't retrodictions like evolution. That's what they've had to do. They're the ones that steal things. They're the ones that go, oh, homology. Oh, we'll change the name. Take it from design to common ancestry. See, they just hijack everything. And I just like exposing that. I can't help it.
Let's get a couple of these. Yeah, right there is an amazing comparison in terms of the predictions and retrodictions, because that's the gold standard of science. And what are we finding in these ERVs? I'll go through a couple of these for the audience sake. So what we've been talking about today, right? Because we've been going kind of sentence by sentence with Viced Rhino, not necessarily going over papers and visuals. But let's do a couple. Let's show the audience what we're talking about. Let's see Viced Rhino engage this. So here's what I was saying earlier. Here's right from the conventional literature. Isn't that right, Matt? Almost 90%. Is that not what I said? Of all HERVs, human ERVs, represent so-called solo LTRs. And yet these LTRs serve a functional role in the genome where they act in gene regulation or help initiate and enhance gene expression. If you were a designer, Matt, okay, you could incorporate similarities to the long terminal repeat that we find in ERVs and retroviruses, and you could add those to the genomes of biological organisms, specifically eukaryotic organisms, because they have properties that make them ideally suited for what? Promoter sequences. It doesn't mean that they're the ancient leftover remnants of past viral infection. And the fact that we see these LTRs that are isolated, just thousands of these isolated LTRs that evolutionists are assuming were once an ERV or part of an ERV that had the gag, the pole, the ENV, as we can see here in this excerpt. Okay. The fact that we actually see these LTRs solo and associated with host genes tells us that they share design features with the promoter sequences of retroviruses and are there because they were intentionally incorporated by the designer, because they consist of what, Matt? Very specific design properties that make them useful in particular settings. This is good design. This provides us with an answer to the important question: are these really the ancient leftover remnants of past viral infections, or are they designed units of DNA function? This is why evolutionists, they have to argue that these LTRs, the solo LTR repeats, got disassociated from the endogenous retrovirus at some point in evolutionary history and ended up being associated with a particular host cell gene. But Matt, this association has to be at just the right integral position in order to function as a promoter. So just coincidentally, it has to be in that right exact position to carry out its function, that it is going to alter the gene expression profile of that gene, because these LTRs end up having consequences for the organism. How does that happen? It makes more sense that these were intentionally integrated into host genomes to perform what they do for good design purposes. This all points to common design. And so, no, we don't have to answer the question, what are the chances of all of these thousands of ERV-like sequences to independently integrate into the human and chimpanzee? You're assuming that they are the ancient remnants of past viral infections. But if they were designed in place for a good reason, then that means they're there for what, Matt?
Purposeful.
Common design reasons. Does that make sense what I'm saying, brother?
Exactly. It's purposeful. It's obvious. But when you're not allowed to start with that starting point, you're doomed to find another explanation, no matter how bad it is. So that's why they ignore these things. That's why they get failure predictions. evolution was true, they would have a very good track record with predictions. But since most of them have completely failed and they live on retrodictions and they sweep them under the rug and they lie to the public, that's a red flag. Those are so many red flags.
Right. Notice here, the endogenous LTRs mentioned above all act as, did I not say this? Enhancers and may increase antiviral gene expression in response to viral infection. So you have viruses coming in that are harmful, and yet these so-called ERV sequences are fighting off those viruses. Here's a couple papers. Endogenous retrovirus LTRs as promoters for human genes. Whole bunch of functions here. ERVs have become integral. Notice how they just say it. They just state it like it's a fact. ERVs have become integral parts of immune defense mechanisms and help to fight off invading viral pathogens. Or maybe they were designed and integrated into the genomes of living organisms to perform those functional roles. And here, so this question about, well, what's the point of all these components? ENV, GAG, POL, so on and so forth. You can go through the conventional literature and find important functional roles associated with each component, Matt. Here's the ENV proteins. Okay. The GAG, the POL. Notice this. Endogenous retrovirus GAG proteins can also restrict retroviral replication. I mean, this is amazing. There's more functions for the GAG. Okay, here's the one I wanted to show for Dan. One of his big argument is, okay, some of these are functional, some of the pseudogenes are functional, but what about the ones that lack necessary component? Because he'll say they're sequence dependent. And if they're missing certain elements, then they can't be functional, right? Anybody who watched the Casey Luskin debate would have heard him say that. Notice this, Matt. All of the antiviral mechanisms described above depend on, notice, Matt, the transcription and or translation of endogenous retrovirus sequences. And so Dan would say, well, what about the ones that aren't transcribed or act in translation, where they're missing parts that don't allow for that? So they can't be functional. Notice this, Matt. It's important. Notice this, audience. Nevertheless, transcriptionally silent. That's what that means, okay? They're not transcribed. They're missing important parts. They must be non-functional, right? But what does this say? Transcriptionally silent ERVs, we also know the same thing is true for pseudogenes, can also provide a selection advantage to the host. For example, the presence of repetitive ERV elements may promote recombination. Well, isn't that interesting? Because recombination is great. It's a great genetic mechanism that helps increase genetic variation, helps with new chromosomal combinations. It's excellent. An excellent mechanism. So these ERV elements may promote recombination processes that increase the number and or allelic variety of host genes. There you go. Matt, the whole point is we can point to functional roles for all kinds of so-called junk DNA.